While the US focused on airstrikes against North Vietnam, the fight in the south was mainly on the ground. General William Westmoreland led US and South Vietnamese forces, working alongside General Nguyen Van Thuy's government in Saigon. Westmoreland's strategy was based on attrition, aiming to kill as many enemy troops as possible instead of securing land. By 1966, large areas of South Vietnam were designated as free fire zones, where civilians were forced to leave, and only enemy forces were targeted. B-52 bombers and heavy artillery made these areas uninhabitable, pushing refugees into camps near Saigon and other cities. Despite mounting casualties on both sides, the enemy didn't back down. The DRV and Viet Cong troops continued to fight, knowing they could quickly reclaim territory, with supplies flowing through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Meanwhile, North Vietnam received support from China and the Soviet Union, which helped strengthen their air defences. By November 1967, nearly 500,000 US troops were in Vietnam, and the number of casualties had risen to over 15,000, killed and more than 100,000 wounded. As the war dragged on, many soldiers began to question why they were still there, especially with the government's claims of victory seeming less believable. As the war wore on, both physical and psychological tolls on soldiers grew. Many soldiers, both volunteers and draftees, suffered from drug use, PTSD, and even mutinies. Between 1966 and 1973, over 500,000 military personnel deserted, and protests within the military grew violent, leading to killings and mass arrests. Back home, Americans were also turning against the war. Shocking images from Vietnam flooded TV screens, leading to protests like the one in October 1967, where 35,000 demonstrators gathered outside the Pentagon. Opponents argued that the US was supporting a corrupt regime in Saigon, while innocent civilians remained victims. By the end of 1967, the communist leadership in Hanoi was growing frustrated. They aimed to deliver a strong blow that would force the US to abandon its hopes of victory. On January 31st, 1968, about 70,000 North Vietnamese forces, led by General Vo Nguyen Giap, launched the Tet Offensive, attacking over 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. Although taken by surprise, US and South Vietnamese forces quickly fought back, and the communists were unable to hold any targets for long. However, the Tet Offensive shocked the US public, especially after it was revealed that General Westmoreland had requested 200,000 more troops, despite previous assurances that victory was near. Facing declining approval ratings during an election year, President Johnson halted much of the bombing in North Vietnam and promised to focus on peace efforts. This shift in strategy was welcomed by Hanoi, leading to peace talks in Paris in May 1968. Despite efforts, talks soon stalled, and after a violent election season, Richard Nixon won the presidency. Nixon aimed to calm the anti-war movement by appealing to the silent majority of Americans, who he believed supported the war. To reduce American casualties, he introduced Vietnamization, a plan to withdraw US troops while increasing bombings and training South Vietnamese forces to handle the ground war. Along with Vietnamization, Nixon kept peace talks in Paris going, while Secretary of State Henry Kissinger secretly engaged in higher-level talks starting in 1968. However, North Vietnam insisted on complete US withdrawal and the removal of General Nguyen Van Thuy, causing the talks to stall. The next few years saw more violence, including the My Lai massacre in March 1968, where over 400 civilians were killed by US soldiers. This shocking event fueled anti-war protests across the nation. In November 1969, over 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. for the largest anti-war demonstration in US history. The anti-war movement divided Americans, especially among college students. For some, the war represented an overreach of power, while others saw opposing the government as unpatriotic. As troops began to leave, those remaining grew frustrated, leading to desertions and mass draft evasion. By 1972, Nixon ended the draft and shifted to an all-volunteer army. In 1970, the US and South Vietnam launched an operation into Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese supply bases, followed by a South Vietnamese invasion of Laos. However, North Vietnam pushed back the invasion. These actions, violating international law, sparked protests on US college campuses. On May 4th, 1970, National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 students at Kent State University. Just 10 days later, police killed 2 students at Jackson State University in Mississippi. By June 1972, after a failed offensive, Hanoi was ready to negotiate. Kissinger and North Vietnam's representatives crafted a peace agreement, but it was rejected by leaders in Saigon. In response, Nixon ordered the Christmas bombings in December, targeting Hanoi and Haiphong, which drew worldwide condemnation. In 1971, a secret study from the Department of Defense was shared with the New York Times. This report looked at the United States' involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967, showing how the conflict had grown over time. It revealed that the Nixon administration had played a key role in making the war worse. This report was leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who wanted to make the truth known. As it was published, more Americans began to see the hidden reasons behind the US actions in Vietnam. Because of this, trust in the government started to fade, and people began to question whether the war was worth continuing. The leak helped to fuel the growing opposition against the war. In January 1973, the US and North Vietnam signed a peace agreement, ending the fighting between them. But the war between North and South Vietnam didn't stop until April 30th, 1975, when the North captured Saigon and renamed it Ho Chi Minh City. The war had a terrible impact on Vietnam, with around 2 million dead, 3 million injured, and 12 million people forced to flee. The country's economy and infrastructure were left in ruins, and rebuilding took a long time. In 1976, Vietnam became a unified nation, but violence still continued for years, even with neighbouring countries like China and Cambodia. However, in 1986, the country began to recover, with new market policies that brought in oil revenue and foreign investments. Relations with the US also improved in the 1990s. In the US, the war's effects lasted much longer. The country had spent over $120 billion on the war, causing inflation, especially after the 1973 oil crisis. The war also divided the nation deeply, with many veterans facing backlash from both anti-war protesters and supporters. Many soldiers also suffered physical harm from Agent Orange. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built in Washington, D.C., with the names of 57,939 soldiers who had died or gone missing. Over time, the number grew to 58,200, serving as a lasting reminder of the war's human cost. Now, I want to hear from you. How do you think this war changed the world's view on the US? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. See you in our next video. Until then, take care and thanks for watching.